Mum, hello again. This is chapter 9 on page 31. Berlin, Polio and Spain. So, when an old woman sits in a chair doing nothing, thinking nothing, looking at nothing in particular, images drift through her mind following one another in random sequence. They come from long ago or not so long ago, just popping up here and there with no apparent reason. Here are 3 that have popped up for Grandma. I guess that's the Berlin, Polio, and then Spain. Berlin, in the winter of 1912-13, Grandma, 8 years old, spent this winter with her parents at number 4 in the Friedrich Wilhelmstrasse, named for Frederick William I, King of Prussia in the 18th century, in the house of Frau Professor Kraus, and she would have been the wife or the widow of Professor Kraus, where they lived in what might be called a service flat. In the flat were 2 sitting rooms, a big one for the whole family and a small one for Fraulein Ferber, Grandma's governess, and Grandma. The parents' bedroom opened off the big sitting room and Grandma's and Fraulein's off the little one. The big sitting room was cosy with a large tiled stove, a typical and effective type of heating in Germany at that time. Grandma remembers having to walk down a long corridor for her bath, with Fraulein always in attendance. She didn't have a bath every day, perhaps only once or twice a week. On other days she stood naked in a basin on the floor in the bedroom, while Fraulein soaped and sponged and dried her. Meals were carried upstairs by a maid and served in the big sitting room at a table which, at least at breakfast, was near the window. Grandma is sure of this because she recalls one cold but sunny morning during breakfast when the family's attention was attracted by sharp taps on the window. There outside was a little canary wanting to come in from the cold. It was probably Fraulein who opened the window to let it in. It flew straight onto the table where it seemed to feel at home, hopping about, picking up crumbs of bread. Fraulein noticed that in Germany all canaries are called Hähnchen, or little Hans. So it became Grandma's Hähnchen, the first pet she ever had, apart from John and Adams, the goldfish. Great names. It was probably Fraulein who went out to buy a cage for him. His cheerful singing gave great pleasure for many weeks, until one morning, unfortunately, he was found dead in his cage. Grandma's first experience of death close at hand, apart from that of the goldfish. The only reaction she can remember feeling was the desire to own another canary. This was discouraged for the present because the family would soon be moving to the Harz Mountains for a few weeks before going to the Isle of Wight for the summer. In any case, the green canaries of the Harz Mountains were famous for their beautiful singing, way beyond that of the more common yellow ones. Grandma remembers clearly leaving the train from Berlin at a little town called Wernigerode and going to a pet or bird shop where a green canary was bought and placed in Hähnchen's cage, which had been bought for the purpose. This one, of course, was Hähnchen too, and his singing did indeed live up to the reputation. By comparison, yellow Hähnchen's had been a mere chirp. Alas, he soon sickened and died, and Grandma was told that the green birds were not as hardy as the yellow ones, but she doesn't remember grieving very long. Grandma does not remember how the journey from Wernigerode to Schurke was performed, whether by small mountain train, by horse-drawn omnibus, or by horse and carriage. By whatever means it was reached, the destination was the Hotel Brocken Scheideck, a large resort type of hotel where the dining room, with a highly polished parquet floor and many tables, made a lasting impression on her. And there's a picture in Grandma Remembers. This was probably because it was here that she sat every evening at her early supper, listening to the musical bells and soft padding of feet of the cows being driven in from the pasture to be milked. Anyone familiar with Goethe's life and Faust will recall that it was to the Harz Mountains that he resorted for refreshment in times of spiritual crisis, and that Faust's harrowing experiences on Walpurgis night occurred on the Brocken. On most days, Fraulein took Grandma to the pond to practice the swimming she had learnt in Berlin. It was shallow, rather stagnant pond. Not very pleasant, especially since the weather was often overcast and somewhat chilly. Grim. Fraulein stood on the edge, watching and ready with a bath towel to wrap around Grandma the minute she came out. What a contrast, Grandma thought, to the large, cheerful pool in Berlin, full of happy, shouting children, all of whom, except Grandma, had to take a shower before entering the pool, which was in the poor district of the city, where the children were presumed to be dirty. And Grandma presumably was not. Interesting. She has often wondered in later years what drew her parents to these mountains. Well known to Goethe, she realizes that a child of 8 would have had no appreciation of the wild scenery, of which she doesn't even remember the wildness. She has also wondered why it was in Berlin that they had chosen to spend the winter. Had it perhaps something to do with her father's laundry machinery, or with the manufacture of it, which he might have wanted to inspect? They had led a settled kind of life in Frau Professor Kraus's house. There were daily lessons in the 3 R's, in German, of course, and there were regular riding and swimming lessons, and walks every day, often past tantalizing displays of bakery and sweets in the shop windows, especially at Christmas time. I think we have a picture of Grandma on a horse about this age. She recalls as being particularly brightly lit and attractive the, more pronunciation, Kurfürstendamm, now well known as an important street in the western sector of Berlin. The best illumination of all for Grandma could be seen every winter's night from the window of the small sitting room. All the windows were of the long French type with low railings across the lower part, so that one could lean out safely to look up and down the broad street. Over to the right was an enormous illuminated sign on the roof of a building quite far away. It flashed on and off. The words were, Pilsner, hell und dunkel. This to her was a marvel. What does that mean? Beer? Something and something. I guess it's the name. It was in the course of this winter that Croak made her memorable trip to Russia, visiting St. Petersburg and Moscow, where she celebrated a second Christmas. See the account of this trip compiled by Grandma and Croak's letters, cards and notes. Oh, we will. It was while she was away that Grandma received from her father the only beating he ever gave her, and which must have been a far more terrible experience for him than for her. He felt he had to, Croak told her years later, because he felt obliged to carry out the discipline usually enforced by Croak, and didn't want Fraulein to have to do the beating. Grandma had told a silly lie about a clean piece of paper he had given her, and which she didn't want to admit to having spoiled. So much for Berlin during the time that pretentious events that were building up in the worldwide conflagration of the following year. In 1914, of course. Another memory that has a habit of popping up in just one short instant in Grandma's beloved Adirondack Mountains at Hurricane Lodge, where, with her parents, she had previously spent 2 very happy summers. Now it was 1916, the 3rd year of the Great War, as World War I was called, which the USA was on the verge of entering. Croak, just out of hospital and desperately weak after a big operation, had taken Grandma to a pleasant resort in Vermont on the east side of Lake Champlain, leaving the latter's very, very ill father at home with a nurse. In early August he had died, and Croak had had to return home for the funeral. She had left Grandma, who had just had her 12th birthday, with Aunt Marion and Emily and Emily's brother, Killian, at a farm not far away, where they were on holiday. Towards the end of August and early September, outbreaks of polio in the northeastern states became an epidemic, and many children dying of the disease. Wow. Many schools didn't open after the holidays, and people were advised not to travel with children unless absolutely necessary. Gosh, all that sounds very, very simpatico at the moment. Grandma's school near Philadelphia remained shut. Since the hotel in Vermont was closing for the winter, Croak hired a car to drive her and Grandma on the ferry across Lake Champlain into the state of New York and to Hurricane Lodge. Grandma was very excited to be going back to this place she had loved remembering the happy summer spent there with her father and mother, when she had been 5 and 7. As the mountains came into view after leaving Elizabeth's town, excitement got higher and rose to fever pitch as the car, passing the summer cottages at Glenmore, plunged down the sandy road into the dark white birch woods of the glen, across the bridge over the brook and up the steep bank, to come out into sunshine at the new lodge, the old one having been burned. There, to the right of the road, it stood, low-lying and more attractive than the old one, as it nestled against the green background of the golf course. Facing them were the 2 Crows, Big and Little Crow mountains, now much more recovered from the fire which had destroyed their covering of trees in the early years of the century, so that now it was only the granite summits that were really bare. Mrs. Balknap, called Cousin Kitty by Grandma because she was a cousin of Aunt Betty's and Auntie Keith's father, came down the steps of the lodge with her warm welcome that never failed, a hug and a kiss. She explained that she was busy shutting up the summer cottages for the winter, that she would put them into winter cottage where the walls were plastered and there was central heating, and that they could have their meals there too when the main dining room closed. From the wide porch or veranda of winter cottage one could look across Keene Valley to the Cascade Range of mountains beyond, with Little Owl's Head in the foreground. Grandma was in heaven, doubtless quite unaware of what Croak's feelings must have been, remembering the times when her Tom had been there too, and that she had been far away from him when he died. Sad. This is so well listed. This ought to be another place which would be nice to think about going to and recovering some of the steps that they made. That night, Grandma was almost too excited to sleep. She was awake next morning early and up before Croak. She dressed quickly, slipped out to the porch, taking care not to let the screen door slam after her. In some houses were fitted with extra doors of wire mesh on springs to keep out insects, and onto the rough, dry grass, and started climbing up the hill, up the side of Little Crow. She remembered having been to the top 5 years ago, wanting to be up there again, and was sure she could find the way. After a short climb, something like a path entered the woods, which clothed the base of the mountain. The sun, already hot, shone mottled through the trees onto the ground that was sometimes grassy with ferns, and with fallen charred tree trunks lying everywhere, over which she stumbled. After a while she became aware of there being no more of these, and of the woods being less wild. She realized that she was on the long, gently sloping side of Little Crow that had not been reached by the fire, the side that faced Keene Valley rather than Big Crow. She must get back to the steeper side overlooking the lodges and cottages, and from which one should be able, if one wished, to reach the saddle that joined the 2 Crows. She realized that she must move over to the right and rise faster. So she kept going further right and found herself on a fairly narrow ledge of rock, at the end of which was a little gully. The more ledges and more gullies, up which she scrambled or across which she jumped. Suddenly, to her right, she was looking straight down on Winter Cottage and all the others, while straight ahead across the saddle rose the rocky dome of Big Crow, forbidding and rather ugly because of the many charred tree trunks still standing. But oh, horror! The ledge on which she stood was so narrow and so high that to look down made her giddy, and when she looked for the way to retrace her steps downward, she couldn't find it. In every direction there seemed to be only cliffs too high to climb or too steep to slither down. She was trapped on this ledge and was frightened. If she hadn't been so frightened, she wouldn't have felt trapped. She longed for her mother, for Winter Cottage, for breakfast. She didn't want to die up there. No. So she decided this was the time to invoke God with prayer. She sat down, closed her eyes, and began to pray. After what was probably not more than a minute or two, she opened them and noticed to the right a gully, through which she must have scrambled to reach the ledge she was on. Looking closely, she could see the parting of the low scrub through which she had forced her way up. God, she thought, had answered her prayer in this way, and she said thank you to him and started going down, abandoning all thoughts of getting to the top, thankful indeed to have been delivered from lonely death on the mountainside. At the cottage, she found Croak wondering where she was, because it was breakfast time. Croak noticed that Grandma's legs were scratched and that she looked dishevelled. But for Grandma, the ordinariness of tidying up for breakfast made the recent terrifying adventure seem unreal. So all she told Croak was that she had been climbing on Little Crow. Croak's response was that Grandma should not go climbing anywhere again without telling someone where she was going. When Croak had first suggested going to Hurricane Lodge until Grandma's school should reopen, she had never dreamed that this might not happen until winter had come in the Adirondacks. The weeks went by. Hot weather of early September turned chilly, then cold by the end of the month, and in early October, while the newspapers continued to report increases in cases of polio, Winter Cottage, with furnaces lit, was cosy enough, even with snow outside. But neither Croak nor Grandma had enough warm clothes. With help from Cousin Kitty and the purchase of a few things in Lake Placid, a winter resort perhaps 5 miles away, they managed. Sometime in October, word came that it was now considered safe for the children to return to Grandma's school, provided certain precautions were taken. Children must keep gloves on while travelling, and nothing was to be eaten in New York. So, Mr. Russell, a local farmer who did maintenance work around the lodge, drove mother and daughter, well wrapped up in rugs, in his open Ford to the station at Westport, where the ferry from Vermont had landed, where they caught a train from Montreal that took them to New York. Grandma was excited, especially a few hours later when, after lunch on the train, she had to be careful to keep her gloves on as they arrived at Grand Central Station in New York, and went by taxi across town to the Pennsylvania station. A few hours more and they were home again in the house at Bryn Mawr. Grandma doesn't remember how soon after that she was back at school, probably after a day or two or a weekend. She was glad to be back, but for Croak, the homecoming must have been dismal and difficult in the extreme, especially since she had not yet recovered from her operation of the previous spring. Finally, when Grandma at 16 was almost an adult, the word teenager was not yet used. World War I had been over for 3 years, and Croak thought it was about time to take her daughter to Europe again to see interesting things. She herself was particularly keen to see something of Spain and the Spaniards, especially of the men whom she regarded as excelling all others in good manners and gentlemanliness. She invited her niece, Grace, later known to the boys as Aunt Grace, to sail on the small and not at all elegant White Star liner Canopic in early June, and to accompany herself and Grandma all summer. And I know Uncle Tommy worked on the Canopic. All three slept in a small cabin where the wash basins didn't have truly running water, while in the dining saloon the tables and chairs were fastened tight to the floor to prevent them sliding around in rough weather. For Grandma and Aunt Grace to read on board, Croak had brought Washington Irving's Story of the Alhambra to prepare them for what was to be one of the high spots of the trip to Spain. The Alhambra, the Red Castle in Arabic, was the citadel and palace built by the Moors in the 13th century on a hill above Granada, the last city in Spain to be taken from them by the Christian armies 200 years later. After about a fortnight, and having landed for a few hours on one of the Azores, Croak's party disembarked at Gibraltar and went for a night or two to Algeciras across the bay in Spain, where they stayed in a most beautiful hotel, the Reina Cristina. There they had 2 bedrooms, each with a balcony, on one of which they sat together, and on a warm summer night, looking out over the water and up the glorious starry sky, while a bird sang. Croak said this was a nightingale. At Algeciras, one morning, they boarded a dirty little steamer to cross the straits to Tangier in Morocco, at that time a part of France's African empire. This narrow water between the pillars of Hercules lived up to its reputation of being one of the roughest strips of the water in the world. Grandma, paying no attention to what Croak and Aunt Grace were doing, spent the whole morning flat on her back on the dirty deck trying to hold on to her breakfast. while inhaling nauseating smells from the galley of cooking in rancid oil. The excitement of arriving in Africa was dampened considerably by the dirtiness of everything, in particular of the hotel, where flies swarmed everywhere, in spite of mosquito nets over the beds that spread over some of the food in the dining room. It was with relief that the three returned to Gibraltar on a much smoother passage and boarded the train for Granada. This train journey should have taken only a few hours, but took in the end a long, long afternoon and evening. At the junction of Bobadilla, the train had to wait for the train coming to meet it from Madrid. This latter train, for some reason unknown to the trio, was delayed somewhere along the line. For several hours, passengers in the first train sat sweltering in their compartments in the intense heat, or else trapped out onto the platform, from which they were soon driven back by the blazing sun. Croak bought bottles of mineral water and little cakes. It was dusk when the arrival of the train from Madrid finally allowed the train for Granada to start moving, thereby cooling the air inside it. It was dark by the time it reached Granada, where Croak's little party, limp and sweaty, stepped out into the very warm night air. She and Aunt Grace were starving and rejoiced at the hotel as the hotel bus drove up to the entrance to see dinner still in full swing at little tables on the terrace, although it was about 10 o'clock or after. Croak remarked that Spaniards always dined late. All Grandma wanted was bed, for she was burning up with a high fever. Croak helped her to get into bed in the double room, saying that Aunt Grace would sleep in the single room, which had been intended for herself. She and Aunt Grace went down to dinner, but not until she had made sure that Grandma got, for a short time, into a cool bath. This bath was to be repeated at intervals during the night and all through the next day. Next morning, Aunt Grace was excited about going to the Alhambra and could hardly wait to start up up to the top of the hill, in which the hotel was about halfway up. Croak announced that Grandma would have to stay in bed, although her temperature was going down. She also said that she and Aunt Grace would start the steep climb as early as possible in order to avoid the noontime sun. They went again in the late afternoon, and the following morning yet again. They never stopped talking about the wonders of the Alhambra. Grandma was now improving so rapidly and was so bitterly disappointed that Croak decided that something would have to be done about the situation. I wonder what. Ever resourceful, she had noticed that every morning and evening drinking water was carried to the hotel in containers, jars or tins, on the back of a little grey donkey. Donkeys were everywhere in Spain. So she asked the hotel manager if she could hire the donkey for Grandma to ride. The manager agreed. So late that afternoon, to Grandma's complete joy, she rode up the hill on the water donkey, thereby saving her strength for walking through the dozens of rooms, halls and galleries of the palace citadel. The building was indeed well named Red Castle, being built solidly of red stone, giving it outside a forbidding aspect, perched there on the top of its rocky hill. Grandma has no detailed or specific memory of it, just a general impression of the contrast between the heavy exterior and the interior lightness and delicacy of the Moorish pointed arches and slender columns, rows upon rows of them, with here and there little gardens or courtyards with refreshing fountains or channels of running water. Grandma was truly thrilled by it, as were the other two, Aunt Grace making an extra trip up with her drawing pad, on which she brought back some attractive sketches. So, in spite of the difficulties, Croak and her daughter and niece achieved one of their great objectives in Spain. The next move was to Madrid, where Croak and Aunt Grace watched a bullfight, which Grandma refused to attend. What the latter enjoyed most in Madrid were the handsome mules, which were extensively used in place of carriage horses. Croak, worried by the hot weather in Madrid, and fearing that it might give Grandma another heat stroke, decided to travel north into Spain as soon as possible. To get out of Madrid earlier than they were booked, they travelled by night train, without berths, to Burgos, where Croak and Aunt Grace wanted to visit the renowned cathedral. None of the three would ever forget that night, packed into a compartment with three other people, a husband and wife, as well as the man whom they dubbed the villain, because of his sinister aspect. He sat in a corner seat beside the corridor, wearing a black skull cap. and from time to time pulling out a sharp knife and loaf of bread, in which he would cut himself a slice. The poor man had great difficulty between these snacks, arranging his long legs and arms in ways that would allow him to sleep. He tried many different arrangements of these four limbs, but none were satisfactory to himself, although they afforded amusement to the three Americans. After this most uncomfortable night, the train reached Burgos at dawn, and there were the cathedral towers rising above the city. After breakfast at an hotel, where Grandma opted to remain and try to sleep, Croak and Aunt Grace made for the cathedral, which didn't interest Grandma. The afternoon of that day was spent on another train, travelling yet further north and west to San Sebastian, and across the French border to Biarritz, the closely adjacent French resort. Here ended the Spanish trip. And this chapter, Mum. I hope that was fun. Sorry I'm reading late, because it probably doesn't mean probably means it's not as read as best it should. But anyway, it's lovely to do this for me as well as you. Lots of love from all of us here. And never forget, we're always thinking about you. Bye and love. Bye-bye.